Amos Hayes stepped out of the sleek black car, the sound of his polished shoes clicking against the cobblestones outside Magnolia Hall. The grand mansion stood like a glowing beacon under the Charleston night sky, its ivory columns wrapped in cascading vines and strings of fairy lights. Tonight was the city's most anticipated event, a gathering of social elites where connections were built and rivalries simmered beneath the surface of champagne glasses. Beside him, Colin Morgan adjusted her emerald green gown, a garment designed to attract attention and confirm her status as Amos's current companion. Her beauty was undeniable, with sharp features and a commanding presence, but her eyes constantly darted around, assessing the scene as though measuring her competition. She turned to Amos with a playful smirk, brushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "We'll own the room tonight," she said, her tone both ambitious and possessive. "Don't forget, we're the couple everyone's talking about." Amos nodded, tugging at his cufflinks. His expression remained neutral, betraying no hint of the storm inside. The truth was, these events had grown tiresome. For years, they were his playground, where deals were sealed and his reputation as a shrewd businessman flourished. But tonight felt different. There was an unshakable tension in his chest, an unease he couldn't quite place. As they stepped into the hall, the opulence of the venue struck them immediately. Magnolia Hall was a symphony of elegance. Golden chandeliers, polished marble floors, and towering floral arrangements filled the air with the soft scent of jasmine. The murmur of polite conversation mixed with the melodic notes of a string quartet, creating a facade of tranquility. "Amos, there you are!" Gregory Blake's booming voice broke through the atmosphere. The host of the evening and one of Amos's most influential associates approached with open arms. His graying hair and tailored tuxedo gave him the air of a seasoned diplomat. And Colin, as dazzling as always. Colin smiled graciously, but Amos's attention drifted as Gregory continued to talk about investors and opportunities. His eyes scanned the room almost involuntarily, and that's when he saw her. Chloe Bennett. She stood by the fireplace, a glass of champagne in hand. The soft amber light dancing against her golden hair swept elegantly to one side. Her black gown hugged her figure with effortless sophistication, but it wasn't just her beauty that struck Amos. It was her presence. She exuded a quiet confidence, a stark contrast to the woman he remembered, someone who once walked on eggshells around him, searching for his approval. Now Chloe owned the space around her, drawing attention with her ease and grace. Amos's breath caught and he stiffened. Colin noticed immediately, her sharp eyes following his line of sight. The colour drained slightly from her face when she spotted Chloe. "Who is that?" Colin asked, her voice deceptively casual. Amos hesitated, his jaw tightening. "That's Chloe," he said quietly. "My ex-wife." Colin's smile turned brittle. "She doesn't look particularly devastated to see you." And she wasn't. Chloe seemed entirely unaffected by his presence. She was laughing softly with a small group of people who appeared captivated by whatever story she was telling. Then, as if sensing his gaze, she looked up. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch. Chloe didn't flinch or falter. Instead, she raised her glass slightly in a silent toast before turning back to her conversation. Amos's stomach churned. There was no anger or bitterness in her gesture, just indifference, a fact that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Colin's grip tightened on Amos's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Interesting," she muttered, her tone laced with venom. "She seems composed, almost too composed." Amos didn't respond. His thoughts were elsewhere, replaying the fleeting moment when Chloe had looked at him, her expression unreadable. It was maddening. Once, her eyes had been an open book, overflowing with hope, love, and eventually, pain. But the woman standing by the fireplace tonight was a mystery, one he hadn't prepared to confront. Gregory's voice pulled him back to reality. "Amos, are you listening? I was saying we have some potential investors here tonight who could be perfect for your next project. You brought the right company to charm them, I'm sure." He gestured to Colin, who immediately offered a dazzling smile. "Of course," she purred, though her attention was still divided, her focus drifting toward Chloe. Amos forced a tight smile and nodded, allowing Gregory to lead them toward a group of sharply dressed men and women engaged in animated conversation. Colin slipped effortlessly into the role of the perfect partner, laughing at the right moments, offering witty remarks, and subtly steering attention toward Amos. Yet Amos could hardly concentrate. His mind was in a haze, his gaze flickering to the fireplace every so often, where Chloe now stood alone, swirling her champagne thoughtfully. Finally, he couldn't resist. "Excuse me," he murmured, stepping away before Colin could protest. Gregory raised an eyebrow but didn't stop him, too engrossed in his own conversation. Amos made his way through the crowd, his steps deliberate yet hesitant. As he approached, Chloe turned to face him, her expression calm and unreadable. Up close, she was even more striking. The years had softened her in all the right ways, her features mature and serene, with a confidence that was almost disarming. "Amos," she greeted, her tone cordial but distant. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." For a moment he struggled for words. The usual charm that had carried him through countless business dealings felt useless in her presence. "I didn't know you'd be here either," he admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. "It's been a while." "It has," Chloe replied, her gaze steady but cool. "And yet, here we are." There was an air of finality in her words, as though she had already closed the chapter of their shared past. Amos felt a flicker of frustration, the need to explain himself bubbling to the surface, but before he could respond, Chloe's gaze shifted. Colin was approaching, her expression as carefully composed as her steps. "And this must be Colin," Chloe said smoothly, offering her hand before Amos could make introductions. "I've heard a lot about you." Colin's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "All good things, I hope." Chloe's smile was equally measured. "Of course." She let the silence linger for a moment before adding, "Well, I won't keep you. Enjoy the evening." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked away, leaving Amos standing awkwardly with Colin at his side. Her scent, jasmine, light and fleeting, lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of her presence. Colin crossed her arms, her gaze hardening. "She's impressive," she said, the word laced with an edge Amos couldn't ignore. "I can see why you married her." Amos's jaw tightened. "Let it go, Colin." "Oh, I'm not holding on to anything," she snapped, her voice low but sharp. "But you? You haven't taken your eyes off her all night." Before he could respond, Gregory called out to him again, motioning for them to return to the group. Amos clenched his fists, forcing himself to refocus. But as they walked back to the circle of investors, he couldn't shake the feeling that this evening was only the beginning of something far more complicated than he'd anticipated. Across the room, Chloe glanced back briefly, her expression unreadable, but her mind lingered on Amos. Though she'd mastered the art of appearing unaffected, seeing him tonight had stirred emotions she thought she'd buried long ago. As the night went on, both knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, one neither of them was fully prepared to face. Amos sat stiffly in the back of the car as Colin scrolled through her phone, her expression a mask of studied indifference. The streets of Charleston passed in a blur, their golden glow from the streetlights doing little to ease the tension simmering in the air. Colin hadn't said much since they left Magnolia Hall, but the sharp set of her jaw spoke volumes. Amos braced himself for the inevitable. Finally, Colin broke the silence. "You didn't have to chase after her like that." Amos sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't like that, Colin." "Oh?" She turned to face him, her tone dangerously light. "Then what exactly was it? Because from where I stood, it looked like you couldn't get enough of her." "She's my ex-wife," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "We were bound to run into each other at some point." "And what a reunion it was!" Colin shot back, her lips curving into a bitter smile. "She didn't seem the least bit fazed, but you looked like a ghost walked into the room." Amos shifted uncomfortably. He couldn't deny the truth in her words. Seeing Chloe tonight had unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. She was supposed to be a part of his past, a chapter he had closed. Yet the sight of her, so composed, so radiant, had brought back a flood of memories he thought he had buried. "Let's not do this tonight," Amos said, his voice firmer now. "It's late and we've both had a long evening." Colin let out a humorless laugh. "Of course. Sweep it under the rug, just like everything else." Amos didn't respond, and the rest of the ride passed in silence. When the car finally pulled up to Colin's apartment building, she opened the door without waiting for him to say anything. Before stepping out, she turned back, her eyes narrowing. "You may want to figure out what you're doing, Amos. Because whatever this is," she gestured vaguely, "I'm not going to wait around while you sort out your feelings." With that, she slammed the door shut, leaving Amos alone with his thoughts. He leaned back against the seat, letting out a slow exhale. He wanted to be angry at Colin for overreacting, but he couldn't blame her. His actions tonight had been a betrayal, intentional or not. And the worst part, he wasn't even sure what he felt himself. The driver cleared his throat, snapping Amos out of his thoughts. "Where to now, sir?" Amos hesitated, then gave the address to his own apartment. As the car wound through the quiet streets, his mind drifted back to Chloe. Her steady gaze, the way she'd carried herself, it was like looking at a stranger, and a memory all at once. He hated how much space she was taking up in his mind. But he couldn't deny it. Chloe was no longer the woman he had left behind. She was something more now, something he hadn't expected. By the time he reached his apartment, exhaustion weighed heavy on him, but sleep refused to come. Instead, he found himself pacing the room, grappling with questions he didn't have answers to. What had he hoped to achieve by approaching Chloe tonight? Why couldn't he shake the feeling that her indifference was the hardest blow of all? Eventually he stopped pacing and sank into the armchair by the window. The city lights outside seemed distant and cold, a reflection of his own restless mind. He closed his eyes, but all he could see was Chloe, her smile, her quiet confidence, and the unspoken message in her raised glass. She had moved on. The question was, could he? The next morning, Amos sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee and staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His mind was still clouded with thoughts of the previous night, but the clarity of daylight brought a new layer of discomfort. Running into Chloe had stirred something deeper than just nostalgia. It was a reminder of everything he'd avoided confronting for years. The chime of his phone snapped him out of his thoughts. A message from Gregory popped up on the screen. "Fantastic seeing you last night. Investors were impressed. Let's meet this week to discuss the next steps." Amos sighed, typing a quick reply before setting the phone down. Business was his safe space, the one area where he never faltered. But last night had shaken that too. Even standing in a room full of influential people, he'd felt hollow. His mind had been tethered to Chloe, to her laughter echoing across the hall, and to the weight of her gaze when their eyes met. For years, he'd convinced himself that their divorce was inevitable, even necessary. He'd told himself that Chloe couldn't handle the demands of his lifestyle, that she wasn't strong enough to stand beside him. But last night had shattered that illusion. She was stronger now than she'd ever been, with or without him. He reached for his phone again, hesitating before opening a search bar. With a few keystrokes, he found her name. Chloe Bennett. The results filled the screen. Articles about her best-selling book, interviews, even a photo from last year's book tour. She looked radiant in all of them, holding her own in front of cameras and audiences. It was a version of her he'd never allowed himself to imagine. Scrolling further, he found an article titled "Wings of Glass, a story of love, betrayal, and resilience." He clicked on it, his stomach knotting as he read the summary. The book was a fictionalized account of a woman rebuilding her life after a toxic marriage. Though no names were mentioned, the parallels were undeniable. Amos closed his eyes, letting the weight of the realization settle over him. She'd turned their broken marriage into art, and she'd done it without him. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Startled, he stood and crossed the room to open it. Gregory stood on the other side, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," Gregory said with a grin, stepping inside uninvited. He handed Amos one of the cups before settling into a chair. "You disappeared on me last night. Care to explain?" Amos sat across from him, staring at the coffee cup in his hands. "I saw Chloe." Gregory raised an eyebrow. "Ah, so that explains the brooding. She's done well for herself, hasn't she?" Amos nodded, the knot in his stomach tightening. "More than well. She's thriving." "And that bothers you?" Gregory asked, leaning back in his chair. Amos hesitated, unsure how to answer. Did it bother him? Was he jealous? Or was it something deeper, regret, maybe even guilt? "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I just didn't expect to see her like that." "Like what?" Gregory prompted. "Happy? Successful? Better off without you?" Amos shot him a glare, but Gregory shrugged, unbothered. "Look, you're not the first man to feel a little lost when the past catches up to you. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Amos leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the window. He didn't have an answer, but one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore this any longer. Chloe had moved on, but the shadow of their past still loomed large. It was time he faced it, whether he was ready or not. Amos stood in front of the modest 2-story house on a quiet street in Charleston's historic district, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. The house wasn't unfamiliar. He'd dropped Chloe and Danny off here once after the divorce was finalized. But it was the first time he'd returned with the intention of stepping inside. The small garden was neat and well-maintained, a bicycle with a flowered basket leaning against the porch railing. A swing set in the backyard peeked out from behind the house, its colors faded but still sturdy. It was a family home, the kind Amos had always imagined providing but never prioritized. For a long moment, he hesitated. He could turn back, say he had something urgent at work, and avoid whatever confrontation awaited inside. But the image of Danny, her shy, unsure smile when Chloe had brought her to court during the custody hearing, kept him rooted in place. She'd been so small then, clutching Chloe's hand tightly, and now she was growing up without him. The thought made his chest tighten. Taking a deep breath, he climbed the steps and knocked on the door. The sound of footsteps and muffled voices grew louder before the door opened, revealing Chloe. She looked surprised to see him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Amos," she said, her tone guarded. "What are you doing here?" He hesitated, suddenly unsure how to begin. "I wanted to see Danny." Chloe's eyes narrowed slightly, her grip tightening on the edge of the door. "You want to see her?" she repeated, as though testing the sincerity of his words. "Yes," he replied, meeting her gaze. I know I haven't been there, but I want to try. I need to try. Chloe didn't respond immediately, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed and opened the door wider, stepping aside. She's in the backyard. You can come in. But Amos… She paused, her voice firm. This isn't just a casual visit. If you're going to be in her life, you have to mean it. I do, Amos said, nodding. I mean it. Chloe studied him for another moment before leading him through the cozy living room and out to the backyard. Danny was sitting on the swing set, her head bent over a book. She didn't notice him at first, too engrossed in whatever story she was reading. Chloe called her name softly, and Danny looked up, her eyes widening slightly when she saw Amos standing there. Hi, Danny, Amos said, his voice catching slightly. It's me. Your dad Danny hesitated, her small frame rigid on the swing. She looked to Chloe, who gave her a reassuring nod before slowly getting to her feet and walking over. Hi, she said softly, her voice barely audible. Amos crouched slightly, bringing himself to her eye level. I've missed you, he said. I know I haven't been around, but I'd like to change that, if you'll let me. Danny studied him for a moment, her brow furrowed in confusion. Why now? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. The question hit Amos harder than he expected. How could he explain the years of neglect, the selfishness that had kept him away? Because I made a mistake, he admitted, his voice raw. I should have been here for you, and I wasn't. But I want to make it right. Danny glanced at Chloe again, uncertainty written across her face. Chloe gave her a gentle smile and placed a hand on her shoulder. Why don't you two sit and talk? She suggested, her voice soft but steady. Danny nodded slowly and turned back to Amos, motioning toward the picnic table under the shade of a large oak tree. Amos followed, his heart pounding as he prepared himself for the conversation he knew he should have had years ago. Amos sat across from Danny at the weathered picnic table, the wood cool beneath his hands. For a moment the silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Danny stared down at the table, tracing the grain of the wood with her finger, her expression guarded. I like the swing set, Amos said, breaking the silence. His voice was gentle, but even to his ears, it sounded awkward. Do you use it often? Danny shrugged, her eyes still fixed downward. Sometimes. Amos hesitated, unsure how to proceed. He wanted to ask her about school, her hobbies, anything that would spark a connection, but every question felt hollow. How could he act like a father now, when he'd been absent for so long? He glanced toward the house, catching a glimpse of Chloe through the kitchen window. She was watching them, her arms crossed as if bracing herself for whatever came next. I saw you reading earlier, Amos tried again. What book is it? Danny finally looked up, her gaze cautious. It's called The Secret Garden. Amos smiled faintly. I remember that one. It's about a girl who finds a hidden garden, right? And she takes care of it. Danny nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around the book she'd brought with her. It's my favorite. The garden was forgotten, but she brought it back to life. It was a lot of work, but it got better. Her words landed heavier than Amos expected. He wasn't sure if she meant them as an analogy, but they struck a chord. That sounds like a beautiful story, he said softly. Maybe you could tell me more about it sometime? Danny tilted her head, considering him. Do you like stories? I do, Amos replied. Maybe not as much as your mom, but I've always liked hearing other people's stories, and I'd love to hear yours. Danny hesitated, her small face twisting in thought. I don't know if you'd like mine, she said quietly. It's not very happy. Amos felt his chest tighten. Maybe it's not always happy, he said gently, but that doesn't make it any less important. And I'd like to know it, Danny, every part of it. For a moment, Danny said nothing. Then, slowly, she opened her book and turned to the first page, as if drawing courage from its familiar words. The garden was locked for 10 years, she said, her voice steady but soft. Everyone thought it was gone forever, but it wasn't. It just needed someone to care about it again. Amos watched her carefully, understanding the subtext of her words. Sometimes things take time, he said quietly, but that doesn't mean they can't grow again. Danny met his eyes then, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of something. Curiosity, maybe even hope. She closed the book gently and tucked it under her arm. Maybe, she said softly. The moment was small, fragile, but it was enough for Amos. He felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly as he gave her a tentative smile. "Thank you for letting me spend some time with you today," he said sincerely. "I'd like to do it again, if that's okay with you." Danny didn't answer immediately. She glanced toward the house, where Chloe was still watching, before looking back at him. "Maybe," she repeated, her tone a little softer this time. As they stood to leave the table, Amos felt a small hand brush against his briefly before pulling away. It was fleeting, but it was something. He followed Danny back toward the house, where Chloe was waiting at the door. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a faint trace of relief in her eyes. "She did better than I expected," Chloe said quietly, as Danny disappeared into the living room. "So did I," Amos replied, his voice just as soft. Chloe studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Let's see if you can keep it up," she said, closing the door gently behind her, as Amos stepped out onto the porch. The air felt lighter now, but he knew this was just the beginning. Danny had given him a tentative chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. Amos sat at his desk late that evening, the city lights twinkling beyond the window of his high-rise apartment. His laptop was open, a blank document staring back at him as his thoughts swirled. The day with Danny had left him feeling both hopeful and uncertain. Her guarded responses and fleeting glances had reminded him how much ground he needed to cover. Yet, her quiet mention of the garden in her book echoed in his mind. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. It was an invitation, fragile but real. Unable to focus on work, he leaned back in his chair, glancing at the shelf across the room. A copy of Chloe's book, Wings of Glass, rested among a collection of business texts. He'd bought it a year ago out of curiosity, but hadn't brought himself to read it. Now, though, it felt unavoidable. The book held pieces of her life he'd never bothered to understand, pieces that might help him make sense of his failures. With a sigh, he stood, retrieved the book, and settled back into his chair. The cover was simple yet elegant, a stained glass window fractured into shards, with a single glowing bird emerging from the chaos. The symbolism wasn't subtle, and it made his stomach churn. Flipping open the first page, he began to read. The story unfolded slowly, detailing the life of a woman named Elise, whose marriage to a powerful businessman had started as a dream but dissolved into neglect and betrayal. It was fiction, but Amos recognized the parallels almost immediately. The descriptions of Elise's loneliness, her struggle to maintain her identity while constantly being overshadowed, were painfully familiar. Amos's throat tightened as he read the chapter where Elise first realized she had become invisible in her own life. The words were raw and precise, cutting through his defenses with alarming accuracy. She had spent nights waiting for her husband, only to watch him drift further away. She had poured herself into her work, writing stories that no one seemed to notice until they became her lifeline. He paused, staring at the page. Chloe's talent was undeniable. But it was the vulnerability in her words that struck him most. She had laid her pain bare, transformed it into something beautiful, and shared it with the world. And where had he been during those moments? He'd been too consumed by his own ambitions to see the cracks forming beneath their feet. The further he read, the more uncomfortable he became. Elise's husband, a man named Andrew, wasn't a caricature of a villain. He was layered and complex, someone who genuinely believed he was doing the right thing, even as he hurt those closest to him. Amos couldn't deny the similarities. He saw himself in Andrew's excuses, his justifications, his blind pursuit of success at the expense of everything else. Halfway through the book, Amos had to stop. He closed it gently and leaned back, rubbing his temples as guilt clawed at him. It wasn't just Chloe's pain that unsettled him. It was the realization that he had been so certain he'd done what was best for her by walking away. In reality, he had only spared himself the discomfort of facing his shortcomings. He stared out the window, the city's glow now feeling distant and cold. For the first time in years, Amos questioned not just his past decisions, but the man he had become. Amos closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, his mind racing. The weight of what he had read felt overwhelming, but he forced himself to return to the book. He knew he couldn't stop now. There was something he needed to understand, something Chloe had expressed in these pages that he hadn't been ready to hear before. As he turned to the next chapter, the story shifted. Elise, after enduring years of neglect and heartbreak, had reached a breaking point. The narrative described the quiet moment when she realized she had nothing left to give, to her husband, to their marriage, or even to the version of herself she had become. The words painted a vivid picture of a woman who had lost everything but still found the strength to leave. Amos's chest tightened. He remembered that night vividly, the argument that had escalated beyond reason, his cold indifference masking the turmoil underneath. Chloe had packed her things while he sat in his office, staring at his phone as if it held the answers to questions he refused to ask. She had walked out, not with a dramatic farewell, but with a quiet, devastating finality. In the book, Elise's departure wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of her transformation. The narrative followed her as she rebuilt her life piece by piece, rediscovering her voice and her worth. The story didn't shy away from the pain of healing, the struggles of learning to trust herself again, but it also celebrated the resilience that came with choosing herself over a relationship that had eroded her spirit. Amos swallowed hard, his throat dry. Chloe's journey had been laid bare in these pages, and for the first time he saw the strength it had taken for her to walk away. She hadn't just left him. She had reclaimed her life, and in doing so, she had become someone he barely recognized. The final chapters of the book hit him the hardest. Elise, now thriving in her career and personal life, faced an unexpected encounter with her former husband. The meeting was brief but profound, filled with unspoken words and lingering tension. It wasn't a reconciliation, but a reckoning, a moment where both characters acknowledged the scars they had left on each other while choosing to move forward separately. Amos closed the book, his hands trembling slightly. The parallels to his own encounter with Chloe at the party were undeniable. She had looked at him with the same calm, detached grace that Elise had shown Andrew, as if she had made peace with their past and no longer needed anything from him. For the first time in years, Amos felt truly exposed. The life he had built, the wealth, the accolades, the relationships, felt hollow in the face of Chloe's strength. She had turned their broken marriage into a story that inspired others, while he had hidden behind his success, refusing to confront the wreckage he had left behind. But now, he couldn't hide anymore. The book had stripped away every excuse, every justification, leaving him with only one question. What would he do with this understanding? He could walk away again, retreat into the safety of his carefully curated world. Or he could confront the past head-on, not to erase his mistakes, but to prove that he was capable of change. As the city outside his window grew quieter, Amos made a decision. Tomorrow he would meet with Chloe, not to apologize for the sake of easing his guilt, but to listen, to understand, and maybe, just maybe, to begin earning the chance to repair what he had broken. Amos adjusted the collar of his shirt as he stood outside the small cafe where he had asked Chloe to meet him. It was a sunny morning, but the warmth of the day did little to ease the nervous energy coursing through him. He had spent most of the night replaying the chapters of Wings of Glass in his mind, imagining what this conversation might look like. Every version ended differently, some hopeful, others disastrous. The bell above the cafe door jingled as Chloe walked in, her presence as composed as ever. She wore a simple cream blouse and jeans, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. It struck Amos how effortless she seemed, a stark contrast to the carefully orchestrated appearances of the people he surrounded himself with. This was Chloe, stripped of pretense, and yet she still carried the same quiet strength that had unnerved him at the party. "Amos," she said, her tone neutral as she approached the table where he was already seated. "I wasn't sure you'd actually follow through." "I wouldn't have asked you here if I wasn't serious," he replied, standing briefly as she took a seat. He waited for her to settle before continuing. "Thank you for coming." Chloe nodded, but didn't respond, her gaze drifting to the menu. The silence between them stretched thin until a waiter approached to take their orders. Chloe asked for a coffee, black, while Amos ordered the same. Once the waiter left, Chloe leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed loosely. "So," she began, her eyes fixed on him. "What's this about? Why the sudden interest in reconnecting?" Amos hesitated, unsure how to begin. He had spent hours rehearsing his words, but now, faced with her directness, all the rehearsals felt inadequate. Finally, he decided to speak plainly. "I've been reading your book," he admitted. Chloe's eyebrows lifted slightly, but her expression remained composed. And it made me realize how much I missed," he continued, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "How much I didn't see, about you, about us, about everything." Chloe let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. "It took a bestseller to get your attention? That seems fitting." Amos flinched at the sharpness of her words, but nodded. "I deserved that," he said quietly. "I deserve worse, honestly. But the book, it wasn't just a story to me. It was a mirror, and I didn't like the man I saw in it." Chloe's gaze softened slightly, though her guard remained firmly in place. "You're right. You didn't see me back then. You didn't see anything but your own ambition." "I know," Amos replied, leaning forward slightly. "I know I failed you, Chloe. I failed Danny. And I'm not expecting you to forgive me overnight, or even at all. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I did, and I'm trying to change." Chloe studied him for a long moment, her fingers tapping idly against the edge of the table. "And why should I believe that?" she asked finally. "You've said things like this before, Amos. Words are easy. What's different now?" Her question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their history. Amos opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come easily. Instead, he took a deep breath, bracing himself for what was to come. Amos met Chloe's unwavering gaze, the weight of her question pressing down on him. "Because I've started to realize that everything I thought I was doing for us, for you, for Danny, was really just for me," he said finally. "I told myself that working hard, building my career would give us the life we deserved. But it wasn't about us. It was about my ego, my need to prove something to myself, to the world." Chloe's expression didn't change, but her fingers stopped tapping against the table. Amos took that as a sign to continue. I didn't understand what I was losing until it was already gone, he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. I didn't listen when you told me how unhappy you were. I didn't see how much you were carrying on your own. And Danny, I left her without a father because I was too proud to admit I couldn't balance my life the way I thought I could. Chloe's jaw tightened, and for the first time, a flicker of raw emotion crossed her face. Do you have any idea what it was like? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. To be the one picking up the pieces every time you didn't show up. To explain to Danny why her father wasn't there for her school recital, or her birthday, or even just dinner. Amos's throat tightened. I can't imagine, he said softly. But I want to understand. I want to hear it, Chloe. All of it. Even if it hurts, even if it makes me feel like the worst person in the world. I need to know what you went through, because I can't change the past, but I can learn from it. I can be better. Chloe shook her head slowly, her eyes glistening. Do you know how many times I've wished you'd said those words before? How many nights I stayed up wondering if I ever meant enough to you for you to really see me? Amos leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. I see you now, he said, his voice firm. And I know it's too late to fix what I broke between us, but it's not too late to be there for Danny, to show her that I'm here, that I'm staying, and that she matters more than anything else. Chloe studied him for a long moment, her emotions flickering between disbelief and cautious hope. Finally, she exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Danny deserves a father who shows up, she said. Not just someone who says they'll be there, but someone who actually is. She'll have that, Amos promised. I'll prove it to her. To you. Not with words, but with actions. Chloe nodded slowly, her guard still up, but her voice softer now. We'll see, she said. You'll have to earn it, Amos, for her sake and for yours. The conversation ended not with a resolution, but with a small, tentative understanding. As Chloe stood to leave, she paused, looking at Amos one last time. I hope you mean it this time, she said quietly, before walking out of the cafe. Amos remained seated, watching her go, the enormity of what lay ahead settling over him. He knew this was only the beginning. Earning back Chloe's trust and building a relationship with Danny would take time, patience, and more effort than he had ever given to anything in his life. But for the first time, he felt ready to try. No more excuses, no more hiding behind ambition. This time, he was all in. Amos stood outside Chloe's house once again, the sound of children playing faintly echoing from a nearby park. It had been a week since their conversation at the cafe, and while Chloe had agreed to let him spend more time with Danny, he knew the real challenge was just beginning. This wasn't about showing up once and calling it progress. It was about consistency, about proving himself not only to Danny, but to Chloe as well. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing louder than he expected. A few seconds later, the door opened, and Chloe stood there, her expression calm but cautious. You're on time, she said, as if testing his resolve. I plan to be, Amos replied, his tone steady. Thanks for letting me come by. Chloe stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. The house smelled of freshly baked cookies, and Amos caught a glimpse of Danny sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by markers and sheets of paper. She was coloring something, her brow furrowed in concentration. Hi, Danny, Amos said softly, stepping into the room. Danny looked up briefly, her expression neutral. Hi, she replied, then went back to her drawing. Chloe gave Amos a look that seemed to say, don't expect miracles. She walked over to Danny and crouched beside her. Your dad's here, she said gently. Remember, You were going to show him what you've been working on? Danny hesitated, then held up one of the papers. It was a colourful drawing of a garden filled with flowers, trees, and a small swing set in the corner. "It's my secret garden," she explained quietly, avoiding eye contact with Amos. "I'm going to make it someday." Amos took the drawing and studied it, impressed by the detail. "It's beautiful," he said sincerely. "You've got a real talent, Danny. I bet if you wanted to, you could make this garden even better than the one in your book." Danny glanced at him briefly, her cheeks flushing with a hint of pride. "Maybe," she said. Chloe stood and crossed her arms, watching them carefully. "Danny, why don't you and your dad go outside for a bit? The swing set's still sturdy enough for two." Danny hesitated again, then nodded slowly. "Okay." Amos followed her out into the backyard, where the familiar swing set stood under the shade of an old oak tree. Danny climbed onto one of the swings, and Amos took the one next to her. For a while they sat in silence, the rhythmic creak of the swings filling the air. "Mum said you used to push me on this swing when I was little," Danny said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Amos nodded, his hands gripping the chains. "I did. You used to laugh so much, especially when you thought you were flying." Danny didn't respond right away, her legs kicking lightly as she swayed. "Why did you stop coming around?" she asked, her tone flat but her words piercing. Amos felt his chest tighten. He had been bracing for this question, but hearing it out loud still stung. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before answering. "Because I was selfish," he admitted. "I thought I was doing what was best by staying away, but I was wrong. I let my own fears and pride get in the way, and you didn't deserve that." Danny looked at him for the first time, her expression a mixture of curiosity and guardedness. "Are you going to leave again?" Amos shook his head firmly. "No, Danny. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. I promise." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, before she nodded slightly and looked away. The swing swayed gently beneath her, the silence between them no longer as heavy as before. The afternoon passed in slow, deliberate steps, each small interaction feeling like a fragile bridge being built between Amos and Danny. After the swings, Danny had shyly suggested they try building something together with her collection of wooden blocks in the backyard. Amos had eagerly agreed, letting her take the lead as they worked to construct a miniature version of her secret garden. "Here," Danny said, handing him a small piece that looked like a tree. "This goes in the corner, near the swing set." "Got it," Amos replied, carefully placing the block where she directed. He couldn't help but smile as she leaned in, her focus entirely on their project. Her guarded demeanor was starting to soften, and for the first time, Amos felt a flicker of hope that they were making progress. "You're pretty good at this," Danny said after a while, her tone light but genuine. "Well, I've had some practice with building things," Amos said, chuckling, though nothing as fun as this. Danny's lips twitched into a small smile, and Amos felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. It was a moment, small but meaningful. Chloe watched them from the kitchen window, her arms folded as she sipped a cup of tea. Diane stood beside her, leaning slightly on the counter. "He's trying," Diane said softly, her voice neutral but thoughtful. Chloe sighed. "We'll see how long it lasts. He says all the right things, but we've heard that before." "Maybe," Diane replied, but Danny's smiling. "That's worth something." Chloe glanced at her daughter, who was now holding up the finished model with a look of quiet pride. She couldn't deny the progress Amos had made, but the scars of their past were still fresh in her mind. Letting herself hope felt dangerous, even foolish. Back outside, Danny turned to Amos with the model garden in her hands. "Can I keep this in my room?" she asked. "Of course," Amos replied, his voice warm. "It's your garden. You can keep it wherever you want." Danny hesitated, then looked up at him. "Will you come back and help me make a bigger one? For real?" Amos's heart clenched. "I'd love to," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "We can make it exactly how you want." She nodded, satisfied with his answer, and began gathering the pieces to carry them inside. Amos stood and followed her to the door, where Chloe was waiting. "You did well," Chloe said quietly, her expression softer than before. "But don't mistake today for a clean slate. Danny might be opening up, but you'll need to keep showing up." "I will," Amos replied, his tone firm. "This isn't just about today or tomorrow. I'm not going anywhere." Chloe studied him for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. "Good," she said simply. "For her sake, I hope that's true." As the evening wound down, Amos said goodbye to Danny, promising to return soon. The look of cautious optimism on her face was enough to keep him going, even as Chloe's guarded warnings lingered in his mind. Driving home, he felt the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. But for the first time in a long while, it was a weight he welcomed. It was the weight of responsibility, of purpose, and of a bond he was determined to rebuild. Amos pulled into the driveway of Chloe's house, the trunk of his car filled with supplies Danny had specifically requested for their next project. It had been a few weeks since their first tentative steps toward reconnecting, and though progress was slow, each visit felt a little less strained. Danny was still cautious, but her guard seemed to drop when they worked on creative projects together, and Amos was grateful for every small sign of trust she offered. As he climbed out of the car, he caught sight of Danny waiting on the porch, her arms crossed in what he recognized as a mixture of impatience and excitement. Chloe stood behind her, leaning against the doorframe with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're late," Danny called out as Amos approached, though her teasing tone softened the words. "Traffic," Amos said with a grin, holding up a bag filled with craft supplies. "But I brought reinforcements." Danny's eyes lit up as she ran down the steps to meet him. "Did you get the paint? The kind with the glitter?" "Of course," Amos replied, handing her the bag. "What's a garden without a little sparkle?" Danny beamed, already rifling through the contents as they headed to the backyard. Chloe followed at a distance, her arms still crossed, but her expression thoughtful. She didn't say much as Amos and Danny began setting up their supplies on the picnic table, but Amos could feel her watchful presence. "So," Danny began as she unpacked the paints, brushes, and small wooden structures Amos had brought. "I was thinking we could make a birdhouse to go in the garden. Maybe two." "That sounds like a great idea," Amos said, grabbing a hammer and some nails. "What kind of birds do you think will visit?" Danny paused, tilting her head in thought. "Bluebirds, maybe?" "And cardinals. Mom likes cardinals." Amos glanced up at Chloe, who was now seated on the porch steps. Their eyes met briefly before she looked away, pretending to be engrossed in her phone. "Cardinals it is," he said, focusing back on Danny. "Let's make them a home they'll love." For the next hour, they worked side by side, Amos guiding Danny as she carefully assembled the wooden pieces into a small, sturdy birdhouse. She painted it with a bright blue roof and glittering red sides, laughing as the glitter stuck to her hands and arms. Amos found himself laughing too, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. "This is going to be the best garden ever," Danny declared, holding up the finished birdhouse with pride. "Do you think the birds will come?" "I think they'd be crazy not to," Amos said, wiping a smear of glitter from her cheek. "You've made something amazing here, Danny." She smiled shyly, her gaze dropping to the birdhouse. "Thanks," she murmured. Then, after a pause, she added, I'm glad you came today." Amos's heart swelled at her words, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. "Me too," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." From the porch, Chloe watched the scene unfold, her expression softening despite herself. She didn't trust easily, especially when it came to Amos, but she couldn't deny the way Danny lit up around him. It was a side of her daughter she hadn't seen in years, a light that had dimmed after Amos left, but now seemed to be flickering back to life. Amos caught Chloe's gaze again, this time holding it for a moment longer. She gave him a small nod, a gesture that felt like cautious approval before standing and heading back inside. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, Amos and Danny moved to the garden plot Chloe had set aside in the backyard. It was small but full of potential, with freshly turned soil and a few potted flowers waiting to be planted. Danny carried the birdhouse carefully, setting it on the ground as Amos knelt beside her, inspecting the area. "Where should we put it?" Danny asked, glancing around. "It has to be somewhere the birds will like." Amos pointed to a sturdy branch on the old oak tree that shaded part of the garden. "How about there? It'll be high enough to keep it safe, but close enough so we can see it." Danny nodded enthusiastically. "Perfect." With Amos's help, she climbed the small stepladder he'd brought and watched as he secured the birdhouse to the branch. Once it was in place, she stepped back, her eyes shining with excitement. "It looks even better than I imagined," she said softly. "It really does," Amos agreed, stepping down and dusting off his hands. "You've got quite the eye for design." Danny's smile widened, but then it faltered slightly. "Do you think you'll come back to see it when the birds come?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Amos crouched down so he was at her eye level. "Danny," he said firmly, "I'm not just coming back for the birds. I'm coming back for you, every chance I get." Danny hesitated, studying his face as if searching for any trace of insincerity. Finally she nodded, her shoulders relaxing. "Okay," she said, her tone tentative but hopeful. Chloe reappeared then, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed one to Danny and the other to Amos, her expression unreadable. "It looks nice," she said, gesturing to the birdhouse. "You both did a good job." "Danny did most of the work," Amos said, smiling at his daughter. "She's got a real talent." Chloe's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she nodded. "It's good for her to have someone believe in her like that." Amos met her eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. "She deserves it," he said quietly, "and I'm going to make sure she knows it." Chloe didn't respond, but her expression softened slightly. "Dinner will be ready soon," she said instead. "You're welcome to stay if you'd like." The offer caught Amos off guard. It wasn't an invitation to step back into her life, but it was a small olive branch, a gesture of trust he hadn't expected. "I'd like that," he said, his voice steady. Danny perked up at the idea, her earlier hesitation melting away. "Can we eat outside? In the garden?" Chloe smiled, a real one this time. "I think that sounds perfect." As they set up the table under the oak tree, laughter and conversation filling the air, Amos felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just about the meal or the garden or even the birdhouse. It was about the beginnings of something new. For the first time, he felt like he was part of a family again, not because of obligation or proximity, but because he was earning his place in their lives. And as Danny leaned against him after dinner, her eyes heavy with sleep, Amos knew this was just the start. He had a long way to go, but he was ready for the journey. This time, he wouldn't let them down. Dominic paced the length of Chloe's living room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He had arrived unannounced, his frustration evident from the sharp tone in his voice when he greeted her at the door. Now, as Chloe stood leaning against the kitchen counter, her arms crossed tightly, she watched him with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "You've been distant lately," Dominic said, breaking the silence. His words came out sharper than he intended. "I feel like I'm competing with something I can't even see." Chloe sighed, her patience wearing thin. "Dominic, I told you I've been focusing on Danny," she said. "Amos has been coming around, trying to rebuild a relationship with her. It's been a lot for both of us to navigate." "And that's exactly the problem," Dominic shot back, his tone rising slightly. "Why is he suddenly playing the hero after all these years? And why are you letting him?" Chloe straightened, her expression hardening. "I'm letting him because Danny deserves to have her father in her life," she said firmly. "This isn't about me. It's about her." Dominic's jaw tightened. "But it's not just about Danny, is it? You've been spending more time with him too. Do you even see what this looks like?" Chloe's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a cool, controlled tone. "This looks like a mother doing what's best for her child, that's all. If you can't handle that, then maybe you're the one who needs to figure out where you stand." The weight of her words hung heavy in the room. Dominic stopped pacing, turning to face her fully. For a moment, his anger seemed to dissipate, replaced by something closer to desperation. "I care about you, Chloe, and I've been trying to be patient, but it's hard when it feels like there's no place for me here." Chloe exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. "Dominic, I care about you too," she said, her voice softer now. "But Danny has to come first. And if Amos is serious about stepping up, I'm not going to stand in the way of that." Dominic shook his head, his frustration bubbling back to the surface. "You're putting so much faith in someone who's already let you down. Do you really think he's going to stick around this time?" "I don't know," Chloe admitted, "but I'm willing to give him the chance to prove it. For Danny's sake." Dominic looked at her for a long moment, his expression a mix of disappointment and resignation. "I can't do this, Chloe," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I can't keep standing on the sidelines, wondering if I'll ever be a priority." Chloe felt a pang of sadness, but nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's best if we take some time apart," she said. "I can't give you the answers you're looking for right now." Dominic stared at her, his shoulders sagging slightly, before giving a curt nod. "I hope this works out the way you want," he said, before turning and heading for the door. As the door closed behind him, Chloe leaned heavily against the counter, exhaustion washing over her. She glanced toward the backyard, where Danny's new birdhouse swayed gently in the breeze. It was a symbol of the progress they'd made, but it also reminded her of the uncertainty that still lay ahead. Chloe stood in the quiet of the living room for a long moment, her emotions swirling. She felt the weight of Dominic's words, the truth in some of his accusations cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. There was a part of her that still didn't fully trust Amos, that doubted his ability to follow through. But then there was Danny. The light in her eyes when Amos was around, the hesitant but growing bond they were forming. That was what mattered most, and Chloe couldn't ignore it. The sound of the front door opening startled her. Danny appeared, her hair slightly tousled from playing outside. She stopped when she saw Chloe's expression, her head tilting in concern. "Mom? Are you okay?" Chloe forced a small smile and crouched down to Danny's level. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Dominic and I just had a conversation, that's all." Danny frowned, glancing toward the door. "Is he coming back?" Chloe hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But it's okay. Sometimes people need to take a step back to figure things out." Danny seemed to accept the answer, though her expression remained thoughtful. "Are you sad?" Chloe's heart clenched at her daughter's perceptiveness. "A little," she admitted. "But I'm okay. And as long as you're happy, that's what matters to me." Danny considered this for a moment before nodding. "I like spending time with Dad," she said quietly, "but I don't want it to make you sad." Chloe hugged her tightly, holding back the tears that threatened to spill. "It doesn't make me sad," she murmured. "Seeing you happy makes me the happiest of all." Later that evening, after Danny had gone to bed, Chloe sat alone on the couch, staring at the faint glow of the television. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen and saw Amos's name. For a moment she debated letting it go to voicemail, but then she picked it up, pressing it to her ear. "Hey," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Hey," Amos replied. "I just wanted to check in. How's Danny?" "She's fine," Chloe said, leaning back against the couch. "She's been talking about the birdhouse all day." Amos chuckled softly. "She's got quite the imagination. I'm just glad she's letting me be a part of it." There was a pause, a comfortable silence that neither seemed in a hurry to break. Finally, Amos spoke again, his tone more serious. "Is everything okay? You sound off." Chloe hesitated, then sighed. "Dominic and we broke up." "I'm sorry to hear that," Amos said sincerely. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Chloe said, though her voice wavered slightly. "It was bound to happen. He couldn't handle everything." Amos didn't press her for details, but his voice softened. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Danny needs you, and you've been amazing for her." Chloe felt a lump in her throat and swallowed hard. "Thanks," she said softly, "and thanks for showing up for her. It's making a difference." "I'm just glad I get the chance," Amos replied. "She's worth every effort." Chloe closed her eyes, letting his words settle over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt a small spark of hope, not just for Danny, but for herself. There was still a long way to go, but maybe, just maybe, they were heading in the right direction. Amos arrived at Danny's school just as the sun began its slow descent, casting a warm golden hue over the small playground where clusters of children laughed and played. He had promised Danny he would pick her up today, a first since they had started rebuilding their relationship. As he parked the car, he took a deep breath, feeling the familiar mix of nerves and determination that had accompanied him since stepping back into her life. Danny spotted him almost immediately, her face lighting up with a hesitant but genuine smile. She waved from the swings, then ran toward him, her backpack bouncing with every step. Seeing her excitement made Amos's chest tighten in the best way possible. It wasn't complete trust yet, but it was a start. "Hi, Dad," Danny said as she reached him, slightly out of breath. "Hey, kiddo," Amos replied, crouching to her level. "How was school?" "It was good," Danny said enthusiastically. "We had art class today, and I made something for the garden. Do you want to see?" "Of course," Amos said, his smile widening. "I'd love to." Danny opened her backpack, pulling out a carefully folded sheet of paper. She handed it to him, her eyes sparkling with pride. Amos unfolded it to reveal a colorful drawing of flowers, birds, and a small pond. "It's beautiful, Danny," he said sincerely. "This will look perfect in our garden. Maybe we can make the pond real one day." Danny's eyes widened. "Really? You'd help me make a pond?" "Absolutely," Amos said. "We'll figure it out together." As they walked to the car, Danny chattered about her day, her voice filled with a joy that Amos hadn't heard before. He soaked in every word, grateful for these moments that felt so ordinary yet so extraordinary at the same time. It wasn't until they were halfway home that Danny grew quiet, her hands fiddling with the straps of her backpack. "Mum said Dominic isn't coming back," Danny said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Amos glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his heart aching at the uncertainty in her expression. "She did?" Danny nodded, her gaze fixed on the window. "She said they needed time apart. Is it because of me? Because—" Amos's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, but he kept his voice calm. "No, Danny. It's not because of you. Sometimes adults have to make decisions that are best for them, and that's what your mum did." Danny was quiet for a moment before turning to face him. "Do you think she's okay?" "I think your mum is one of the strongest people I know," Amos said honestly. "And I think she'll be just fine. She's always doing what's best for you." Danny seemed to take comfort in his words, nodding slightly. "I hope so," she said softly. "I don't want her to be sad." Amos smiled at her through the mirror. "She's got you, Danny, and you make her happier than anything in the world." Danny smiled faintly, her shoulders relaxing as the car turned into their driveway. As Amos pulled into Chloe's driveway, he noticed her standing on the porch, a book in hand and a small, contemplative smile on her face. She looked up as they arrived, her expression brightening slightly when she saw Danny hop out of the car, clutching her drawing. "Mom!" Danny called, running up the steps. "Look what I made in art class. It's for the garden." Chloe knelt down to inspect the drawing, her smile growing wider as she looked it over. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, pulling Danny into a hug. "I love the colors." "Dad said we could even make a pond someday," Danny added excitedly, glancing back at Amos, who was walking up the steps behind her. Chloe arched an eyebrow at Amos, her expression half amused, half skeptical. "A pond, huh? You're really committing to this garden." Amos chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "What can I say? I'm in deep now." Chloe shook her head, but there was a warmth in her eyes as she straightened. "Well, if anyone can pull it off, it's Danny." "Exactly," Amos agreed, giving Danny a playful wink. "She's got the vision. I'm just the hired help." Danny giggled, clutching her drawing like it was a priceless treasure. "Can we start on it this weekend?" "We'll see," Chloe said gently, ruffling her daughter's hair. "Let's talk about it later, okay? For now, why don't you go put your drawing in your room so it doesn't get crumpled?" "Okay," Danny said, darting inside with a bounce in her step. As the door closed behind her, Chloe turned back to Amos, her smile fading into something more serious. "Thank you," she said softly, "for today, for being there for her." Amos nodded, his gaze steady. "She's amazing, Chloe. Every time I spend time with her, I realize how much I've missed. I don't know how to thank you for giving me this chance." Chloe studied him for a moment, her arms crossing loosely. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "Just keep showing up. That's all I care about." "I will," Amos promised. "I'm not going anywhere." Chloe nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Good. Because she's starting to trust you, Amos. Don't make her regret it." The weight of her words wasn't lost on him. "I won't," he said, his voice firm. "I mean that." For a moment they stood there in comfortable silence, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the porch. It was a quiet, unspoken truce between them, a mutual understanding that, while the past couldn't be undone, the future was still being written. Danny reappeared a moment later, carrying a small box of garden tools. "Can we plant something before dinner?" she asked eagerly. Chloe glanced at Amos, and he smiled. "Let's do it," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "What are we planting?" As Danny led them to the garden, rattling off her ideas, Amos felt a rare sense of contentment. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Amos sat at the kitchen table, the dim light from the overhead lamp casting a soft glow across the room. The day had been productive, another step forward in his journey to reconnect with Danny, But tonight wasn't about her. It was about Chloe. They had agreed to talk after Danny went to bed, and now, as the clock ticked toward 9, Amos felt a nervous tension building in his chest. The sound of Chloe's footsteps brought him out of his thoughts. She entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea, one of which she set in front of him. Her expression was calm but guarded, her movements precise as she took the seat across from him. "Thanks," Amos said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. Chloe nodded, her fingers tapping lightly against her own cup. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a fragile thread. Finally, Chloe broke it. "So," she began, her tone steady but firm, "you said you wanted to talk. I assume this isn't just about Danny." Amos nodded, exhaling slowly. "It's not," he admitted. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything that happened between us, and I realized I owe you more than just an apology." Chloe arched an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Go on." Amos leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on her. "I know I hurt you, Chloe. I know I let you down in ways I can't even begin to justify. I was so wrapped up in my own world, my career, my goals, that I didn't see what I was losing. I thought I was doing the right thing, but the truth is I was just scared." Chloe's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't interrupt. Amos took that as a sign to continue. "I was scared of failing," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Of not being enough. And instead of facing that, I pushed you away. I told myself that letting you go was better for both of us. But it wasn't. It was cowardly. And I hate that I made you carry the weight of everything I left behind." Chloe inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around her mug. "You did," she said, her voice low but steady. "I carried it all, raising Danny, dealing with the fallout of our marriage, trying to rebuild my life. And you weren't there, Amos, not once." "I know," Amos said, his throat tightening, "and I can't change that. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I put you through, and I see how strong you've been. You didn't just survive. You thrived. And I don't think I ever truly appreciated how amazing you are until now." Chloe's eyes softened for a moment, but the walls she had built over the years remained firmly in place. "Words are easy, Amos," she said. "You've always been good with words. But what happens when things get hard again? What happens when the novelty of showing up wears off?" Amos leaned back, his gaze steady. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted. "But I know I'm not the man I was back then. I've learned what matters, Chloe, and I know it's going to take more than words to prove that to you and Danny. I'm ready for that." Chloe looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I want to believe you," she said finally, her voice quiet. "But I don't know if I can." Her words hung in the air, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them both. Amos knew this was just the beginning of a long conversation, one that would test the fragile truce they had managed to build. Chloe stood up from the table, walking over to the window. She stared out into the darkness, the faint outline of the garden barely visible under the dim glow of the porch light. Amos watched her, sensing the inner conflict she was grappling with. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost distant. "There were so many nights," she began, "when I sat in this house alone, wondering if I made the right choice by leaving. I kept telling myself I had to do it, for Danny, for me. But the truth is, part of me hoped you would wake up and fight for us, that you'd realize what you were losing and come back." Amos felt a pang of guilt, his hands tightening around the mug in front of him. "I wish I had," he said quietly. "I wish I hadn't waited so long to see what was right in front of me." Chloe turned to face him, her arms crossed tightly. "And now you're here, saying all the right things, but I can't help wondering, What if it's too late? What if we've both changed too much? Amos stood, closing the distance between them. Maybe we have, he said. Maybe we're not the same people we were back then. But that doesn't mean we can't find a way forward. I'm not asking you to forget what I did, Chloe. I'm asking for the chance to show you that I've learned from it. Her gaze wavered, and for a moment Amos thought she might walk away. But then she sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. You've been good with Danny, she admitted. Better than I expected. She's starting to trust you, and that means something. It means everything to me, Amos said, his voice firm. But this isn't just about Danny. It's about us too. I don't want to just fix my relationship with her. I want to fix what I broke between us. I know it's not going to happen overnight, and I know I have a lot to prove, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Chloe studied him, her expression guarded but not unkind. And what if we can't fix it? She asked. What if the damage is too deep? Then at least I'll know I tried, Amos said. But I believe we can, Chloe. I believe we can find something better than what we had before, something stronger. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to respond, but no words came. Instead, she turned back to the window, her reflection faint against the glass. Amos stayed where he was, giving her space to process everything he had said. The silence stretched on, heavy, but not uncomfortable. Finally, Chloe spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can trust you again, Amos. But for Danny's sake, I'm willing to see where this goes. Amos exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of reconciliation, but it was a start. That's all I'm asking for, he said softly. As Chloe turned back to face him, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, hope, perhaps, or at least the willingness to entertain the possibility of it. Amos knew this was only the beginning of the work he had to do, but for the first time, he felt like they were truly on the same path, however uncertain it might be. The Charleston Book Festival buzzed with energy as crowds of readers, authors, and publishers filled the event space. Amos stood near the entrance, scanning the room for Chloe. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, coordinating with the festival organizers and quietly ensuring her work would be highlighted in a way that reflected her talent. He didn't want to overwhelm her. He simply wanted her to feel seen, truly seen, for the remarkable person she was. Finally, he spotted her. Chloe was at a table near the center of the hall, surrounded by a modest group of fans. She looked radiant, her confidence shining as she signed books and chatted with readers. Danny stood by her side, holding a stack of books and beaming with pride as she handed them to Chloe. The sight made Amos pause, his chest tightening with a mixture of admiration and guilt. This was the life she had built without him, a life filled with purpose and resilience. Taking a deep breath, he approached, careful not to interrupt. Chloe glanced up as he neared, her expression shifting from surprise to something softer. Amos, she said, setting down her pen, I wasn't expecting you here. I wouldn't miss it, Amos replied, his voice steady. You're the star today. Chloe gave him a small smile, but her eyes remained cautious. Danny, however, lit up. Dad, did you see Mom's book display? It's huge. She pointed toward a towering stack of Chloe's novels near the main stage, where a banner bearing Chloe's name and book title hung prominently. I saw, Amos said, grinning at his daughter. Your mum's a big deal. Chloe glanced at the display, her brow furrowing slightly. That's more than I expected, she said, her tone unsure. I thought my table would be tucked into the corner somewhere. Before Amos could respond, a festival coordinator approached, smiling warmly. Miss Bennett, we're ready for your session. Please follow me to the stage. Chloe hesitated, her eyes flicking between Amos and Danny. "Danny, why don't you stay with your dad while I'm up there?" she suggested. Danny nodded eagerly, grabbing Amos's hand. "Can we watch from the front row?" "Of course," Amos said, his voice reassuring as he met Chloe's gaze. "We'll be right there." As Chloe followed the coordinator, Amos led Danny to the audience area, finding seats near the stage. Danny bounced in her seat, brimming with excitement. "Mom's going to be amazing," she whispered. "She always is," Amos replied, his voice filled with quiet pride. The lights dimmed slightly as Chloe took the stage, the audience falling silent in anticipation. Amos watched as she stepped up to the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. She began speaking about her journey as a writer, her voice steady but filled with emotion. The crowd hung on her every word, captivated by her authenticity. As Chloe continued, Amos felt a deep sense of gratitude for this moment, for the opportunity to witness her brilliance, and for the chance to play even a small part in supporting her. He couldn't change the past, but here, in this room filled with strangers who admired her, he realized just how much he wanted to be part of her future. Chloe paused briefly, scanning the audience as she spoke about the challenges of her journey, balancing her role as a mother, rediscovering her passion for writing, and finding the strength to share her story with the world. When her eyes landed on Danny, sitting beside Amos in the front row, her lips curved into a soft smile. The sight of them together was bittersweet, a reminder of the pain that had brought her here and the unexpected moments of healing she hadn't anticipated. "As I wrote Wings of Glass," Chloe continued, her voice clear but tinged with emotion, "I wasn't just telling a story. I was reclaiming my voice. I was taking back the pieces of myself I thought I'd lost forever. And in doing that, I learned that even the most shattered things can become whole again. Maybe not in the same way, but in a way that's stronger and more beautiful than before." The audience erupted into applause, but Amos barely heard it. Her words struck something deep within him, a reflection of his own journey. He watched as she stood there, poised and glowing, and felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not for what she had accomplished on her own, but for the resilience and strength she had shown despite everything. Danny leaned toward him, her voice a whisper. "Mom's the best, isn't she?" "She really is," Amos replied, his voice thick with emotion. After the session, Chloe was swarmed by attendees eager to ask questions and get their books signed. Amos stayed back with Danny, giving her the space to shine. Danny, however, tugged at his hand. "Can we go talk to her now?" "Let's wait until she's free," Amos said gently. "She's got a lot of fans to meet." Danny's face lit up. "Like a superhero." Amos chuckled. "Exactly like that." They waited until the crowd began to thin before approaching her table. Chloe looked up, surprised but pleased to see them. "You didn't have to wait," she said, though her tone was soft. "Didn't want to steal the spotlight," Amos said with a grin, his attempt at levity earning a small laugh from Chloe. Danny placed her drawing from earlier in front of Chloe, beaming. "For you, Mum, to go with the garden." Chloe's expression softened as she picked up the drawing, her fingers brushing the paper. "It's beautiful, Danny. Thank you." Amos cleared his throat, his voice quieter now. "You were incredible up there, Chloe. Truly." Chloe met his gaze, her defenses lowered, if only slightly. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being here." Danny tugged at Chloe's sleeve. "Can we get ice cream to celebrate? Dad said he knows a place with the best sprinkles." Chloe hesitated, glancing between Danny and Amos. Then, after a brief pause, she nodded. "Sure," she said, her voice lighter than it had been all day. "I think we've earned it." As they left the festival together, Danny skipping ahead, Chloe and Amos fell into step side by side. The air between them was tentative but hopeful, like the first rays of sunlight after a long storm. Neither said much, but for the first time in years, it felt like they were moving towards something. Not the life they had lost, but something new, something worth fighting for. The garden was nearly complete. A winding path of small stones snaked through neatly arranged flower beds, and the birdhouse Danny had painted hung proudly from the oak tree. The pond, a modest but charming addition, reflected the golden hues of the late afternoon sun. It wasn't grand or perfect, but it was theirs, a shared project that had brought them closer with every step. Amos stood at the edge of the garden, hands in his pockets, watching as Danny carefully arranged a few final flowers in the soil. She was humming softly to herself, her concentration entirely on the task at hand. Chloe knelt beside her, offering gentle guidance when needed. The sight filled Amos with a quiet contentment he hadn't felt in years. "Looking good, kiddo," Amos said, stepping closer. Danny glanced up, her face lighting up with pride. "It's almost done. The birds are going to love it." "They'd be lucky to have a home like this," Amos replied, crouching beside her. "You've done an amazing job." Chloe smiled faintly, brushing soil off her hands as she stood. "She's had a lot of help," she said, her tone light but warm. Danny beamed, her gaze flicking between her parents. "It's the best garden ever," she declared. Then, as if struck by a sudden thought, she added, "Do you think we could add a bench, so we can sit and watch the birds together?" Amos exchanged a glance with Chloe, who raised an eyebrow. "What do you think, Chloe?" he asked. "Room for a bench?" Chloe hesitated, her gaze drifting over the garden. "I think that sounds like a good idea," she said finally. Danny clapped her hands, her excitement infectious. "Can we build it this weekend?" "Absolutely," Amos said, smiling. "We'll make it happen." As Danny turned back to her flowers, Chloe moved to stand beside Amos. They watched her in companionable silence for a moment before Chloe spoke, her voice low enough that Danny wouldn't hear. "She's happier than I've seen her in a long time." Amos nodded, his gaze fixed on Danny. "She deserves to be happy," he said. "I just want to make sure I keep it that way." "You're doing well," Chloe admitted, her tone softer than he expected. "Better than I thought you would." "Thank you," Amos said, his voice quiet. "That means more than you know." Chloe turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "This hasn't been easy," she said, "for any of us. But I think we're finding our way." Amos met her eyes, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. "I hope so," he said, "because this, us, Danny, the garden, it's worth everything." Chloe didn't respond immediately, but the faint smile that touched her lips was enough. For the first time, Amos felt like they were on the same page, even if the road ahead was still uncertain. They had built something fragile but real, and that was more than he could have hoped for. As the sun dipped lower, casting the garden in hues of amber and soft pink, Danny finished her last patch of planting and wiped her hands on her jeans. She looked up at her parents, her face glowing with satisfaction. "I'm done," she announced, standing and stretching. "It's perfect now." "It really is," Chloe said, stepping closer to admire the finished work. She brushed a stray leaf off Danny's shoulder and crouched down to meet her daughter's eyes. "You've worked so hard, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Amos nodded in agreement, his voice filled with warmth. "Me too. You've got an eye for this, Danny. Maybe we should start calling you our little garden architect." Danny giggled, the sound light and carefree. "Can we invite the birds to come tomorrow?" she asked, glancing at the birdhouse and the pond. "They'll love it, right?" "They'll be here in no time," Amos assured her. "And when they come, we'll sit on that bench you talked about and watch them together." Danny smiled, but it quickly turned into a yawn. Chloe caught it and ruffled her hair. "I think someone's earned an early bedtime tonight," she said gently. "But—" Danny started to protest, then stopped, another yawn betraying her. Okay, maybe I am a little tired. Chloe smiled and guided her toward the house. Danny waved at Amos as they went inside. Good night, Dad. Don't forget about the bench. Good night, kiddo, Amos called back, watching them disappear through the door. He stayed in the garden for a moment, the quiet settling around him like a soft blanket. The space they had created together felt alive, filled with hope and possibility. It was more than a garden. It was a symbol of their healing. Chloe returned a few minutes later, stepping onto the porch with 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to Amos, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. They stood together in the fading light, the garden stretching before them. She's happy, Chloe said softly, breaking the silence. Really happy. She is, Amos agreed. And that's all I want, for her to feel safe and loved. Chloe looked at him, her gaze lingering. You've shown her that, she said. You've shown me that too. Amos turned to face her, his expression serious but hopeful. I know I can't change the past, he said. But I want to keep building on this, for her, for us, whatever that looks like. Chloe took a long sip of her tea, her thoughts clearly racing. Then, setting her glass down on the porch railing, she met his eyes. It's not going to be easy, she said. There's still a lot we need to figure out. I know, Amos said, but I'm not going anywhere. Whatever it takes, I'm here. Chloe smiled faintly, a mix of caution and genuine warmth. Then let's take it one step at a time, she said, for Danny's sake and ours. Amos nodded, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation or a sudden resolution, but it was enough. They had come through the storm together, and now, under the soft glow of the setting sun, they were finding their way forward. As they stood side by side, watching the first stars begin to appear, Amos felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope.